What's up, guys? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today is Brian and myself, and we are going to be talking about preparing for a summer shred season. So the reason that I wanted to do this episode is far too often I see on social media, I hear from clients, friends, etc. People think that in like May or late April, it's time to like start dieting to be like super lean and in shape for summer like you've always hoped for. And my perspective, you're generally pretty late to the game at that point. So what I wanted to do and roped Brian into helping me or signing off on this and really talking about it is I want everyone to know about getting started early, right? Like with many other things in life, getting started early is generally going to provide the best result for you. So we wanted to put this episode out super early in March to help all of you out. Before we jump into the meat and potatoes of today's topic, Brian, what's the latest?
Well, first off, I also have been a victim of starting my diet too late. And so 2 years ago, I had a really successful cut and I started it in the end of May. So last year, I bumped it back a month and started it at the end of April. And that was way better. But I think almost that because I started it earlier, I gave myself more grace and leeway, and I had more like refeed days. I even took a 2-week diet break, and I actually hit my goal later in the second time than I did the first time. So I dieted much harder for like 3.5 months the first time versus the second time where I think I dieted for 4.5 months. And it just kind of like meandered and felt like it was never ending. So there is that too. Like maybe the lesson is more that the diet should be about 3 months instead of 4.5 months, but you can still start it earlier and end it earlier, right? So like my diet didn't end until mid-September, maybe starting it earlier, ending it in like late July, and then I'm still shredded throughout most of the summer.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the notes I have here on my end. A reason of starting earlier is like, let's face it, you're going to have periods where you might get sick. You have like a work, life, family thing pop up. There might be refeeds, diet breaks. Like rarely have I seen, and like obviously people like, I literally do this for a job. Rarely do things plan out exactly in the amount of weeks as you or turn out exactly the amount of weeks as you plan them for. So for that, it's generally like a 12-week diet may end up turning into like a 17, 18 total, like start to finish, because there are periods in between where progress isn't made, something happened, there's diet breaks, all of these other things. So I'm going to cover this in a little bit more depth. Yep. But yeah, it's a little bit short-sighted to think that like those 10 to 12 weeks are going to be all hands-on and like really perfectly executed as your plan is laid out.
Yeah, totally. I didn't mean to derail updates into like the actual convo, but I didn't want to forget that little piece before we moved on. So as far as updates for me, though, I actually don't have a whole lot to say at the moment. Training's continuing to go well. It's actually kind of funny. I on my Follow My program, I post 5 workouts a week, but I wrote in the write-up that the plan is to try and do 6 every 9 days. So it actually ends up being a little less than 5 a week, but just in case, I post 5 a week. And I've been, without really having to even think about it, just kind of following it at the rate that I suggested, which was 4.5 sessions a week. So I'm still having to go back to like last week's in the app to go look at it. And people that I know are following the program are like literally sticking to the program and are, 5 sessions every week, no matter what, like clockwork. And so it also makes me think that, maybe the people following my program are going to be ready for a deload potentially sooner than I might be, because I'm getting an extra like half rest day each week. So for anyone following the program, something to keep in mind, but just something I thought about as I was doing my workouts this week and realizing I had to go back to the prior week to go fetch those workouts. But continuing to get more comfortable with training in the commercial gym. I'm actually kind of starting to dig it. I like all of the equipment options. Still not a huge fan of the diagnostic blurring that occurs with having to make equipment swaps here and there. And it's actually something maybe we talk about at some point on an episode, because I was having a conversation with Ishak about it when we were training last week. And he was like, bro, when you train in a gym like this, you just don't even worry about it. Like hypertrophy is super forgiving. You hit your target RIRs and like you have a couple movements that you always make sure you prioritize to always do at the same point in your workout. But he's like, at some level you just have to be okay with it and, you know, put in the effort and let the effort kind of dictate your progress. So so that's kind of how I'm trying to look at it. And as long as I have, you know, one or two main movements that I do say, okay, I'm gonna do these first each session, and then the rest of it can be a little bit more malleable, that's kind of helped me keep my head from exploding throughout this whole thing of this new experience. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I feel you there. There was in my current program, I have incline barbell bench again for the first time in, I don't even know, like months and months. And towards the end of our time in Arizona, I just couldn't get into the gym like during like your empty hours. And I couldn't, it was always like being used, and I had to like just move on. So my gym session had turned into like an hour and 40 minutes on waiting on stuff. And it was interesting because I would normally do it. Like I would do like a warm up exercise, which was like an anterior delt, like front raise, like cable front raise thing. And then I would move right into that. But like the last session, I couldn't get to it until like 5th on my exercise list. And I was like, oh, well, there goes like any hopeful, you know, hope for progress. But it is kind of interesting to see too. I dropped 1 rep on my top set, even only after doing it like that. And so I was pretty surprised by that. I was like, okay, there's less drop off than I had anticipated because of the increased fatigue of performing, you know, 4 other movements first. But I totally get what you're saying.
Yeah. No, totally. I mean, like, maybe it is, man, I wish there was a way we had a study. Like, there are studies, in fact, discussing, like, advanced trainees doing auto-regulated exercise selection versus, like, a strict regimented exercise selection. I think it was something like, you know, one group squatted on Mondays, leg pressed on Wednesdays, and did leg extensions on Fridays or something like that. And that was what they did every week. And the auto-regulated group could come in and choose which one of those 3 leg exercises they wanted to do on any given day based on like how they were feeling and where their motivation was. And I think that the auto-regulated group actually had a significant increase in response than the group that was forced into doing those movements on those days. But anyway, I'll have to look into that, and I can come back and circle back with that. But it is interesting, and maybe something we can spend an episode on down the road. But I am super curious, as I'm sure the listeners are, to hear about your cross-country trek, your birthday, and where you're settled at for the moment.
Yeah, so we have settled into a rural part of Virginia. We're about like, I think, 90 minutes, maybe like 60 to 90 minutes. I don't really know. I'm not overly familiar with the area. North of Richmond. I think actually like northwest. So we are out there. The closest gym is the only gym in the county is 22 minutes away, each direction. The best, someone commented on my story last night that they said, this looks like a high school football weight room. And I'm like, you know what? Like, this is exactly what it is. So it is very like bare bones, dumbbells up to 100, a leg press, a Smith machine, only one like cable stack. And, that is what I'm working with, but I'm excited to just like simplify things and see how creative I can get and still provide, you know, target stimulus and that sort of thing. So I'm very excited for the change.
The principles from N1 that we learned would basically say that any movement that you usually use with a dual cable, you can just do with a single cable with one arm.
Yeah, and I have done that in the past for sure. Like the press arounds and stuff will get a little bit harder because there's like nothing to create leverage from or to brace against. Yeah, stability. But we'll see. We'll see what I end up doing. But I'm excited just for. I think I'm going off on a little side here, but I think big long term, right? What Jenny and I will call like our forever home and forever life. I think I want to live like rurally, however you say that word. So this is our like test run of like living out in the countryside and seeing how that translates. Because I've, you know, aside from like I grew up like living in the suburbs, but ever since like literally for the past like 12 years, I've lived like in cities. So this is an interesting trial run into that.
2 questions on that. Do you still think, as of the moment, that Utah is where you would like to settle? And
yeah,
2,
if you made me... If you made me change...
And 2, do you think you're going to join a gym in this rural location or potentially try to build out your own home gym?
So yes, if you ask me like right now where I want to live long-term, it would be the Salt Lake area in Utah. And then 2, I have a gym there that I love and I cannot wait to go back to. But long term, I want like a detached barn on the property that houses my gym equipment, office, etc. And that's my end goal, is to have basically like a detached like barn structure on the property where I will have like a gym and stuff inside of, and then spend all of my free time out there doing what I want to do. But we'll see how that works out in reality once that time comes.
Sweet. I like it. How was the birthday in Nashville and everything?
Birthday was cool. It was my first time in Nashville. So it was, we went to Jeff Black's gym, which is Iron House Strength and Conditioning, which was out by like the airport. Super, super cool spot. Like just a really big gym with tons of different equipment, all the weights in the world type of thing. Really, really like the exact type of gym that I really like to find. Like I love finding gyms like that in any city and stuff we go to. It's just so different than, you know, a 24-hour or a Gold's or an EOS, something like that. So I love, one, supporting like friends and their businesses. I love supporting small gym owners and independent gym owners and strength and conditioning facilities. And the energy and vibe and environment in those gyms is just bar none in my experience. So that was really, really cool. And then saw like downtown of Nashville that night, which is I think Broadway Street, and it was interesting.
Did you hear some country music from every bar? Yeah,
people, tons of live music, which was cool. Tons of people around. It's just interesting. I just have zero interest in participating in those types of activities at this point in my life. Like I like seeing it, right? Because it's a new experience, but I didn't want to like go in any of them or anything like that. I was really tired also from like the long driving and stuff, but it was really cool. And the drive was great. You know, there was a point in my life where like a cross country drive was like this big, daunting, like stressful experience, but it wasn't in like the slightest bit. We used the Google search along route feature to find exactly the type of food we wanted, and we would just like plan out, okay, we're going to be in like Little Rock in about 3 hours. Let's plan for lunch around that time. Let me look and see if there's like, you know, I just went down like my list. Is there a Chipotle? Is there a Qdoba? Is there like some Asian type of grill, Mongolian grill? We ended up stopping at Taziki's Mediterranean Cafe in 2 different cities, and that's about like as best type of food you could ask for on the road. And we ate really, really good. Like there were zero compromises. We stopped at a Sheetz to get like a snack one time, and I got a cup of fruit and like a non-dairy protein, RTD protein drink. And that was like the quote, you know, air quotes, worst meal of the entire 4 days.
Yeah, that would be one of my positive meals on a road trip.
So that's like, I've been kind of toying with this idea, is like, I would have that mindset around it as well. And when I have conversations with clients, that's a big things that come up on like when people are moving or something like that. But it's just like a little bit of planning, and that Google search along route feature is just a game changer. So long as you have like some sort of planning, and you can be like, okay, you know, in about 4 hours, we will be in this city. Let's push lunch from like noonish to 2-ish type of thing. You really expands your options, which I thought was really, really cool.
I feel like that probably works for like hotels and stuff too, right?
Yeah. So we only stayed in one hotel, and we picked one right next to a Qdoba, because we planned like, oh, okay, we're going to get in late. Right. We'll eat dinner at Qdoba. And then Jenny picked a hotel that had like a full buffet breakfast. So for breakfast there, I had like black coffee. I had a little bit of oats. They had like breakfast potatoes and eggs. And ironically, they didn't have any fruit. So that was probably the worst meal I had, which was like eggs, like red skin potatoes and oats with black coffee. That was probably
could be worse.
Oh, it could be so much worse. But I was really surprised with how seamless the meal and eating went with this, with just some basic planning and knowing what we were looking for. Yeah, road trip was great, and I'm excited it's over. Excited to get back into work, and I have a standing desk, which I'm really, really excited about too. that is one of the downsides of like the lifestyle and the travel is like I'm working at kitchen tables and stuff a lot. So there was a period, oh man, like 5 years ago when I was at a standing desk full time, and like my back and hips and stuff felt incredible after a couple months of that. So I'm really excited to do that. Yesterday was my first day, like fully standing. Today will be my second day. And I'm excited just to have that flexibility again.
Are you standing while you talk to me right now?
I'm standing right now while we're recording this.
Amazing. You move a lot less than me.
I'm in a power stance, so it keeps me kind of locked in.
Nice. I kind of wade side to side.
Yeah. Cool. Are you ready to jump into today's topic?
Yeah, buddy.
Cool. Let's do it. So kind of what I alluded to earlier in the episode, or when we started talking about it, is so by the time we're recording this on March 8th, it will release on March 14th. By the time you listen to it, might be the 21st, something like that. And I want to plant this seed, or we want to plant the seed kind of early to help you get ahead of your plans to be in great shape for the summer. As with most things in nutrition and training, unfortunately, things do not progress quite as fast as we may hope for them to. So in doing so, Brian and I are hoping to get you started early so that you can be, at the very worst case, ready early and then can feed into summer, which will allow you to remain leaner while eating more food, what I refer to as the best of both worlds and my favorite nutrition periodization. So when that is the worst case, you are in a pretty damn good spot. So what I think is pretty cool, when Brian and I put together our notes for this episode, we have kind of two slightly different approaches. And I think these are reflective of the way that Brian and I do things a little bit differently. So I am more objective by the book type of approach, and Brian is a little bit more, I'm going to leverage, the past 25 years of eating and training and subjective habit, routine, and basically just skill sets that you've acquired to guide you a little bit more in the beginning. So for the listeners, we'll provide kind of two different approaches, and then you can find yourself using, one or the other, or probably a little bit of both, what I would imagine most people would do. So Brian, do you want to kick us off with your kind of high level approach?
Yeah, for sure. Many of you guys have either seen my post on Instagram about this or heard me discuss it on here about kind of my off-season satiety-based tracking system that I use. So just as a refresher for people, essentially when I'm in off-season, as we would call it, where I'm not actually dieting, right? I'm kind of trying to gain weight. I usually follow this method of tracking 3 variables. So each morning I weigh myself and I make a little note in an Excel sheet. Each day I track my protein grams just roughly in my head, because I know more or less within 5 grams or 10 grams what each thing I put in my body is going to have as far as protein goes. So I get like a general ballpark number, and then I write that down in my Excel sheet. And then I also have a subjective measure of satiety, where I basically define my day as being either underfed, overfed, or satisfied. And the majority of the days just end up satisfied, but I do try to skew more to having more overfed days and less underfed days when I'm in this off-season period. So when I do begin to diet, the first thing that I like to do is just track 2 or 3 days and get an idea of where my kind of off-season calories have been sitting. And I don't do much with that aside from just acknowledge that that's where I'm at. And then I go immediately right back to my satiety tracking. But now, instead of focusing on having more overfed days, I try to have still the majority satisfied days, but I try to have almost all of the days that aren't satisfied just be underfed. So I'm eliminating overfed days. I don't have any days where I'm like uncomfortably full anymore. And then I try to add in 1 or maybe 2 underfed days. So we're looking at, 5 or 6 satisfied days and 1 or 2 days where I might go to bed a little bit hungry at the end of the day, which is totally fine. And so usually the first thing that I do in this situation is manipulate portion size. And the portion size manipulation comes entirely from carbs and fat. So I don't decrease my protein at all. I just make sure that the carbs and fat are slightly lower. So an example of this that I often use is to think of like the way that a meal might look for me in the off season, and it might have a double hamburger, so like 8 ounces of meat, some cheese on there, and a bun, and then I'll have a side of mashed potatoes and a vegetable. And that's like kind of a typical off-season meal for me. Well, when I begin going into this cutting phase, that meal is going to immediately lose the bun. That's the first thing to go. So now it's 2 hamburger patties with some cheese on them, mashed potatoes, and vegetable. The next thing that would go down the road, if needed, would be to cut the cheese off. So now I have 2 hamburger patties, some mashed potatoes, and some veggies. And then if needed, down the road from there, I would eliminate the mashed potatoes, and they might become like a baked potato of some sort. You know, I like to cut them thin and bake them for 40 minutes or something, and they end up kind of crispy. So I'm a huge fan of that. So there's kind of these different small steps that you can take over the course of time to manipulate what you're eating and putting into your body as far as total caloric amount without having to necessarily track everything specifically, because you just know that not eating this bun is going to make this meal significantly less calorically dense. So that's kind of the beginnings of my setup. Do you have any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, what I like is that you kind of have these skills you've acquired, right? Of knowing like, hey, if I want to easily reduce total, caloric content on the day, something like removing a bun, right? And generally like a hamburger bun is going to be processed, right? It's going to be like a white bread style type bun. And it's like a simple, I want to say like it's probably 40 or 50 grams of carbs, right?
Yeah, I think it's 40 carbs, like 150 calories or something like that.
Yeah, so something like that is like, it's a simple, it's kind of like a mindless change that gets you moving, right? And then moving into like, okay, then I will like remove the cheese, right? Things that are just like not very satiating, or there's not a ton of volume for the caloric content. So these really cool just kind of swaps and modifications you can make without like playing macro math or anything like that yet, which is really cool.
Yeah, so one of the things that I am a huge proponent of, and I don't ever take out even at like the depths of a diet, is intra-workout nutrition. And I know there's arguments for sure of like, they're liquid calories, they don't have food value. You could eat a more complex, dense carbohydrate source instead of Gatorade powder or whatever. And I get that, but when ultimately the success of your diet is kind of defined by A, reaching your goal, and then B, reaching your goal without losing much muscle, performance in the gym is the best proxy we have for ensuring that you've gained muscle, or rather not lost muscle. And so for me, like, just having that nutrition, something to sip on before, during, and then after the workout, it gives me something to look forward to between sets. It keeps me going. And I think this is a great time to reference a study that, again, man, I need to think about these studies before we get on air so I can actually be accurate with it, because I'm really just like reaching back into the depths of my brain here. But there was a study that was done where they gave some people no food before a workout. They gave some people like a real food, and then they gave some people like a slop that had 0 calories in it, but it was sweet, and so it spiked, the internal sensation of having food in you. And the people that had the real food and the slop both performed equally as compared to the group with no food that performed not well. So I think that there is something to having that continuous supply of glucose going into the body, and then I mix it with whey, so there's that as well. But that's something I never give up on, and I think you've stated your opinion on that. Do you want to remind us real quick what you think about that?
Yeah, so it's really contextual. So people like Brian and myself, yes, I am going to keep my intra-workout in throughout my diet. It is liquid calories. It is non-satiating. It will improve performance. That being said, waving massive asterisk here. Brian and I are people who do not have adherence problems when we are dieting. Brian will talk about, I go to bed hungry. when I'm dieting, a majority of people, an overwhelming majority of people, will crash and burn with that approach, right? I literally just had a conversation with a client, and this one's funny. He ran out of macros at the end of the night. And when we did our like kind of triage, I was like, well, okay, so you were hungry at the end of the night, you ran out of calories, like, well, what did you do? And he's like, I had 2 ice cream sandwiches. And I was like, why? Of all the things you could eat, like, why would you eat ice? Why would you like, okay, I'm going to eat ice cream sandwiches. So I think like it comes back to like your skill acquisition, your understanding, and ultimately your adherence. If adherence is not a problem for you and you're like, yes, I am going to sacrifice satiating foods at the end of the day or some other period of the day so that I can ensure I get that extra uptick in training performance, and I'm willing to consciously take that trade-off. Yes, I think it is beneficial to keep those intra workouts in. If you're someone who has issues with adherence, I would recommend that being one of the first things you pull, to be completely honest. Okay, so with the intra workout, if you are someone who has adherence issues to begin with, I would 100% recommend removing the intra workout from your diet, right? And pushing those calories, those carbohydrates to like a satiating carbohydrate, something that's going to give you some volume. That being said, if you are willing to sacrifice a bit of satiety in in addition to preserve your training performance and increase that, ultimately, I think that is on paper the best move. However, on paper doesn't account for adherence, satiety, and the subjectivities of what it means to be human. So ultimately, depending on where you fall in that context is how I would approach handling that.
Yep. One thing I wanted to as well kind of drop in here, because you made a comment about, me going to bed hungry. And one of the best things I did when I began dieting a couple years ago was just accept in my brain that I was going to be hungry. Like, I had heard so many stories and talked to so many people that have, tried all of these like calorie-free sweeteners or like Quest protein cakes or like whatever sort of wild other concoctions you can try to whip up that are going to give you a ton of food volume with very low calories. And it ends up almost always backfiring, and you just end up becoming so food focused that all you're thinking about is the next fake food that you're going to whip up. So if you just go into the diet and you're like, look, this is 12 weeks or 16 weeks or whatever it is, and at points of this diet, I will be hungry, and then embrace the hunger. One of the biggest tricks that works for me is I don't allow myself to be hungry really during the day. So I structure my intake such that I actually feel quite satiated during the day, but then I'll just have my last meal at 5 or 5:30 or something like that. And I will know that by 7 p.m. I'm going to be hungry, and then I'll be hungry until I fall asleep. But then I wake up the next day and I'm not really that hungry anymore, and I just kind of get to eat again. So to be able to relegate that hunger to just this small period of time before bed works really well for me. And I know with others, they can't go to sleep if they're hungry or something along those lines, which I get too. But I actually really like that hollow, empty kind of stomach feeling before bed. It actually helps me sleep a lot better. So the common sentiment of, your sleep goes to shit when you're dieting and stuff like that. I know I haven't been 3% body fat lean like a natural bodybuilding competitor. I've been 7-8%, but I haven't noticed any of that. So maybe that's something that's unique to me, and I know everyone's different in that way as well, but just wanted to kind of throw that out there as well. And then do you have any thoughts on that before I move on?
Yeah, it's going to be very individual, right? Because there are other people who like that hunger will really impact their sleep. So people like that, I would kind of swap it, and that would be pretty much the only time I will recommend people go with like an intermittent fasting type thing. Because what can we do at 8 a.m. that we don't really want to do at 8 p.m. to help mitigate hunger? Caffeine, right? Black coffee, appetite suppressant.
And self-control's higher in the morning too.
Exactly. So it's easier to be hungry in the morning for most people as opposed to before bed. So that is one of those things that I would generally recommend there. But yes, depending on what level of leanness you are trying to get to, let's say 15% and under, it is likely at some points you will have to deal with some hunger.
Yep, totally. So just to kind of finish up the way that I do things right now, we're at this period where I've reduced portion sizes from taking hamburger buns off and then reducing cheeses and things like that. So I'll usually keep this up for 4 to 6 weeks, still not really tracking food, just monitoring portion sizes, keeping protein high. And then what's happened in the past is about 4 to 6 weeks into this, weight loss begins to stall a little bit. And if it stalls for 10 or 14 days or so without, seeing that kind of catch up in that drop, the whoosh, so to speak, then I will at that point kind of begin tracking. And I'll initially take a baseline and see where I am as compared to like my off-season typical day. And by this point, I'll usually have that 500 to 700 calories below, at least, maybe up to 1,000, depending on wherever I was in the off-season. So I'll begin tracking, and the first week is mostly just data collection, making sure that I have the right numbers, that I have a good meal structure and setup, and that I'm hitting the objective calories that I'm trying to hit. And usually just by tracking, this has happened the last 2 years, just by beginning to track at all, weight loss begins to pick up again because I have that data, and I'm just having the nature of having to just write something down is more accountability than just saying I'm going to take a hamburger bun off or something along those lines. So as I kind of get deeper in and have started tracking, then I usually begin instituting kind of official structured refeed days where it's like, okay, I've been hungry now for a few days in a row. I'm going to add in 1 day. And then over the course of another 4 weeks, that might become 2 days or something along those lines. And as that happens, my rate of weight loss slows. So that's one piece too, is like in the beginning, weight loss just happens rapidly and I'm not even tracking. I'm just doing this portion control thing. And I'll probably lose 8 to 10 pounds in the first 4 to 6 weeks just by being cognizant of that and dropping these more like kind of simple carbohydrate sources or fat sources like cheese. And so then as I institute these refeed days, I don't often increase the deficit on the other days to account for the refeed days. I kind of just keep the deficit the same, and I understand that by having these refeed days that I'm going to slow my progress down a little bit. And that's been valuable for me because in the past I would try and be like, okay, well, if I'm going to have refeed days, I have to keep the weekly caloric total lower, and I would then compensate on the other days, and then the refeed days would come and I would binge because I was restricting so much. So when I finally just decided that, okay, I'm no longer going to get the same rate of weight loss, I'm just going to accept that it's going to be half of that or a third of that or whatever it is, then I know that I'm kind of in the grind of it. And maybe that's why my diets tend to drag on a little bit. Like when we even look at my last one last year, I went down from 200 to 190 in the first 6 weeks, I think. And then I took a diet break. And after the diet break, I just couldn't get going again. I couldn't get the momentum going, probably because I was beginning to institute these refeed days and just the rate of loss was lower. So, I ended up getting down to 182, but it took me to go from 190 to 182 was like 12 weeks, whereas the first 10 pounds were like 6 weeks, and the whole thing was 18 weeks. So rate of loss, I think, is go ahead.
The only thing I wanted to add there that I don't want people to get hung up on is that first 10 pounds that you did in those 6 weeks, arguably 4 to 5 pounds of that are going to be shifts in fluid, glycogen, etc. Let's say probably at most 60% is actual fat loss.
Yeah.
And then that next subset of weight is you don't have those again.
I actually would argue that maybe the first 4 or 5 pounds, almost none of it is actual fat loss, because I was, 199.6 when I started my diet last year. And within I think 8 days, I was down to 195.2 or something. So I'd lost like 4 pounds in a matter of 8 days, which really is just a matter of, hey, you're eating less carbs, you're carrying less water and retaining less fluid, et cetera, et cetera. And so yeah, I think, I probably really lost 5 pounds in the first 6 weeks, but on the scale, it says I lost 10 pounds in the first 6 weeks. So definitely a good point.
Exactly.
There. Yeah. And then, so as I kind of said earlier, I took a diet break last year. After the first 10 pounds, I went to Wisconsin and I took a diet break, and I didn't do that the first year. So it is something that I'm probably going to end up doing again this year, because we are doing another trip to Wisconsin. The potential alternative, and I'm considering this, though not committed yet, is that our trip to Wisconsin's a little later this year. It's in early July instead of mid-June. So it's only 3 weeks, but if I start my diet earlier, then maybe I can gain 4 weeks on the front end, gain 3 weeks on the back end, and then maybe my diet can just be over when I go to Wisconsin instead of that being a diet break. So if I were to do that, I would need to start my diet here, basically, as we're saying in this episode, at the end of March instead of at the end of April. And then if I start at the end of March and then I have through the end of June, that's 3 months plus a couple days in July. So if I were pretty aggressive with it, I could probably do it. The other side of that coin is I'm actually not as big right now as I was last year. So last year I got up to, like I said, 199.6. I think I'm right around 195 or 196 right now. So that could also be another tool that I can use to kind of facilitate a shorter cut this year. But yeah, those are kind of my my main points. And yeah, let's hear how you do it a little more objectively.
So I'm not going to actually talk about my personal approach as much as kind of big impacting factors and considerations that I want the listeners to take away. I generally, in my personal life, will take long diets and cover big grounds. Like, I've really only been through 3 dieting phases in my life. The first one, I lost like 28 pounds, and that's when like everything in nutrition really clicked for me. And I was like actually like lean for the first time. Second was this past year, when, right after we had started ETP, I went from about 207, 207 and a half, I think was the highest, down to like 190, 191 actually. And that was about like 16-week diet. The first one was, I think, about 16 or 18 weeks or something like that. And then I did like a 10-week one, like a 1 year in the one. But I'm talking like those are 3 diets from 2018 until now, and it's 2022. So I don't even really do one per year. The way I wanted to talk about this is really just in terms of adding some numbers to help solidify your approach. So generally speaking, about 0.5% to 1% of your total body mass, so that's not like lean body mass, that's basically your body weight, per week is a really, really good target. Now, using some examples here, at 200 pounds, that's approximately 1 to 2 pounds per week. If you're only 150 pounds, that's approximately 0.5 pound to 1 pound per week. It's also important to note that as your weight will decrease over time, that 0.5% to 1% will also decrease over time. The next thing I wanted to talk about is estimate how much you think you want/need to lose to hit your target body composition. And then I recommend realistically adding 50% to that. It is just human nature to think, oh, I need, 10 pounds to get, shredded. Realistically, it's probably 15 to 18 or something like that. Similarly, for a timeline, right? And I alluded to this in the beginning of the episode. Take your basic timeline that you are thinking, right? A really, really good way to create a very rough estimate of that timeline is to plan for 1 pound of loss per week. Now, I know we have a decent amount of female listeners to this podcast, and for you guys that are on the smaller side, just note that that 1 pound per week may be unrealistic if you are 110 pounds, 130 pounds, or something like that. It might be a little bit unrealistic in the later parts of your dieting, or even in the beginning. So let's plan. I said with that example, if you have think oh, I have 10 to 12 pounds to lose and I'll be lean. Realistically, let's make that about 18 for a conservative effort. Then we're looking at approximately 18 weeks to really hit that total goal. And then the reason I say that is I prefer to be conservative with my estimates. And the worst case scenario there is you're ready early. And the reason I say that is there are many things that could come up. You might get sick, and then you might have a week that's a push. You might have a wedding weekend where you're traveling, or some family trip plan. Like Brian was just talking about the yearly family vacation. That might be another week where it's kind of a push. And I think it's just realistically 5 out of every 6 or 4 out of every 6 weeks might be super consistent progress weeks. And then lastly, with that worst case scenario, if you're ready early and it's the end of May, right? Summer's not even there. And you're like, hey, I'm lean. I don't really care to get any leaner and I'm ready for summer. You can start your recovery diet process earlier and start increasing your food intake. And then, like I've talked about on the podcast many times before, this is what I consider like the holy grail of periodization. You're lean, your energy levels are improving, your food volume's improving, training's improving, your muscles are filling out as glycogen and fluids begin to replenish in them. And then you can maintain an overwhelming majority of that fat loss, but then return your calories back up to maintenance through summer so that you're not necessarily living in restriction through summer. You are incrementally increasing your food throughout summer while your physique kind of improves throughout it. So that is what I would consider the worst case scenario, which is kind of also the best case scenario. So just some numbers to help you wrap your head around putting together a plan over the coming months.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. The holy grail of nutritional periodization, that period of time where you're eating more food and looking better. It's amazing, right? So, yeah, I mean, I feel like both of us have seen this happen in pictures and in our experiences too, where you look so flat at the end of the diet. And then, so even if you do something like, you have a week-long peak week protocol where you're, adding in carbs progressively or whatever your approach is, and then you look great at the end of that week, but then it's even the next 2 to 3 weeks after that, if you don't go completely overboard and do cheesesteaks and apple pies and all that stuff, then you do get progressively filled out, bigger, and you still have abs. So it really is the coolest, most exciting period. And it's one of those things that is so cool and something so fun to look forward to that it almost makes the diet worth it with this end in sight thing where you get this uptick at the end. It's really a really cool thing and a motivating factor.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think I look at the diet as the calorie deficit, right? The bottom, the lowest amount of calories during your calorie deficit is kind of I wouldn't call it the halfway mark. I would call it maybe your 65% mark. Now we have another 35 to 40% left to complete everything. And when we release this episode next week, maybe I'll put some stuff up on my story. But last year, when I wrapped my diet the last week of July last year, 2021, my calories were the lowest. I was 191-ish and change. I wrapped my recovery diet in the probably early October, and I look better. I'm eating 900 calories more per day, and my weight is within a pound of the dieting phase.
I know,
so
it's insane.
And I went and I got DEXAs and I got lab work and all that stuff. So this is something that I don't find a lot of people, coaches and stuff in the space talking about. It's generally after the diet, return to maintenance as fast as possible. And there's trade-offs in any direction, but I personally, and this is what I generally do with my clients as well, take the approach of reversing more slowly so that we can, keep greater control and a more fat lost over that period.
Yeah, I think that as we've discussed in prior episodes, that the way in which you decide to implement calorie increases after the diet depends on how lean you got. And if you're at 7-8%, that's lean, that's super lean. But it's not like 3 to 5%, and like the way that you had to dig to get those last couple percentage points off. So I fully agree. Like at 8% body fat, like you're just beginning to catch on fire. So you can kind of put that fire out just with a little bit of calories. But when you're straight up burning for like weeks at a time, you need to just like pummel yourself with food and use the sledgehammer approach.
I agree 100%. Yeah, the context of getting on stage versus not getting on stage really does change the game in that final like 90% of the diet, even maybe 85 to 100 or whatever. Like, really, really good point there.
So last year before my diet, you encouraged me to do that full blood work panel. And then I did it again after the diet. And so I'm going to do the same thing again this year through the life extension. And you also sent me the link to the DEXA place in Boulder that you found. So Aaron's been doing all my research for me so that we can actually get like some real data here. And so hopefully before I actually officially start dieting here, whenever that is, I will have some blood work and a DEXA for us to kind of cover on the show.
Very cool. Yes. I just love the data. I love the decisions it helps you make, and some of the like subjective fear and what's the word I'm looking for? It just helps. Mm-hmm. So I love it, and so I'm all for it. So I'm glad you appreciate the my interest.
For sure. No, and I think it'll be good content for the show too, especially considering I've never had a DEXA. I'm actually kind of nervous that like maybe I'm actually way fatter than I think I am, so maybe I'm like sitting at 195 pounds and I think that 14% body fat or something because I still have a 6-pack, and then the freaking DEXA comes back and says I'm like 18% body fat.
I actually had this happen with a client really recently where I would put a lot of my money on that DEXA is just wrong. And the hard thing is like sometimes the DEXAs are like old and they're at like a university or something like that, and maybe they haven't been calibrated in a while. But this client is like lean, like his check-in photos, full obliques, things like that. His separation between back muscles and stuff like that. And it put him at like 17.6% or whatever. And he was like super bummed out. And I was like, listen, it's wrong.
Does he hold it in his glutes and legs maybe?
No, he's lean.
Yeah.
And I was like, I told him, I was like, at the highest, I think you're probably like maybe high 13s. But I found with like the newer, more like, people like you and I, like fat loss, body composition aimed, like privatized DEXA type stuff, those places, the machines are generally newer, and they're generally more reliable.
Sweet. Well, I'm excited. And when I get back to Boulder, I'm going to go get that done and we'll get some data.
Definitely. Anything else you want to add on this one, Brian?
No, man. All good.
All right. As always, guys, thank you for listening. I hope you guys find this episode helpful and can get started and timeline out your diets a little bit so that you can be ready for whatever look you are looking for this summer. If you have any questions about any of this, feel free to reach out to Brian and I, or leave some comments on this episode on YouTube where we can find them easily and get you, as always, context appropriate and nuanced responses. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.